Hi, as part of your Unit 3, what we are going to explore this time is the fundamentals of typography. Firstly, what is type? What is a typeface? These are the first questions that you might have. Type is basically characters or letters that are printed or shown on a screen. A typeface is basically the design of that lettering, which can either be a variation in size, weight, which is how bold is it or is it thin, slope, as in is it straight or italic, width, is it wide or condensed or narrow, and then so on. Each of these variations of a typeface is a font. What is a font? A font is basically a graphical representation of text. So the look and feel of letters is what decides a font. Now there are several things that actually impact the font, which is point size, the weight of the font, the color of the font, or even the design. So all of the versions that you see in front of you, which you're familiar with, your Arial, Cambria, Impact, and so on, are all fonts of their own. They are unique because of their characteristics. Every letter of that font represents those characteristics. For example, all the letters of Arial obey certain specific rules, which are different from the letters of Times New Roman, where they all have some different rules on which they are built. Which makes typography the art of actually arranging type in such a way that your text is legible, readable, and appealing to the reader. So typography is the visual design of text for all practical purposes. Now, it's not easy to actually go forward with this unless you understand how letters themselves are structured. Let's take a look. For example, here we have the word typography written. A majuscule or a capital is basically how these letters like T are written. Then you have something called a counter, which is the gap in between a completely closed loop letter. An ascender is the part that goes above the body of a letter. Now the main body of a letter, which you see in the size of the letter A or the base of the letter H, is called the X height. So whatever goes below that is called a descender. Now sometimes for letters like Y or G, there is also a loop, and some letters which have several components at two levels are called two-story letters. These are a few basics when you want to understand. A single letter is called a character in typography. The portion in between is called X height. And the portion that goes below this baseline is called a descender, while the part that goes above that X height line is called an ascender. When you have letters that have a long spine, that is called a stem. The spaces in between that is enclosed in this letter is called a counter. Now for some classes, there are projections at the ends of each letter form. Those are called serifs. Now this is one of the most important classifications. That is, when you look at any particular font or lettering, you decide whether it has a serif or not. That makes it a serif or a sans serif font. The small projection that you see on the letter G is called a ear. This is not very common and is more likely seen only on serif fonts. And the enclosed spaces over here in this loop is called a shoulder. Now you must have noticed that a lot of these texts basically have names based on the anatomy of human body. So for example, the letter E has an arm, then there's an ascender, then there's a bowl. After that there is a spine in the letter S, there's an ear or a tail. All of these are parts of the human body. They are often reflecting the anatomy. But when you actually study the anatomical differences between texts, that is when you will be able to distinguish the differences between fonts. For example, even in serif fonts, you see how Bodoni is different from Times New Roman, and that is also different from Caslon. For example, Bodoni seems to have very wide spines, whereas Times New Roman is a lot thinner and its strokes are much more uniform. Then you take a look at Caslon. All of these are very different. Take a look at the year of the letter G in both Bodoni, Times New Roman as well as Caslon. Every font has its own characteristics based on how these small features are caught. Now this is one way in which you can understand how a type or a font is different from another font. But this is not the only thing that you need to keep in mind. It's not just the design of the lettering but also the arrangement of all of these. For example, the negative space in between the letters can also be adjusted. This is called kerning. Why should we do kerning? It's important because some letters have a different form compared to other letters. How do you make sure that a vertical letter, which is different from a diagonally formed letter, is different from a curved letter, and yet when they are all arranged together, the amount of space between them looks reasonable to the eye? So that is when kerning becomes important, because you visually have to make an estimate, and this is something that you get better at with practice. Softwares like Illustrator and InDesign give you the option of actually adjusting the amount of space between the letters. So when you adjust them, you can actually make sure that you've used the font to the best of your possibility, and that is when you can understand that a letter has been arranged typographically in a visual pleasing manner. These are just some basics to start you off on the journey of typography. What I would suggest is to actually open any particular software, be it Microsoft Word or any design software, print out a set of text and put it in different fonts so you can actually see for yourself the difference between each of them. Next, you can also try writing those fonts using a chisel pen to see if you can make out a difference between each font. This way, you will understand the beauty of using the visual design of text, which is typography, in design.